want to start with today is an overview of some of the different themes that are guiding scholarship in American literatures and American studies right now. And I use the plural on purpose because one of the kind of big things that's happening in American literature study at the university level and in scholarship is to really move in a more inclusive and plural direction. And then another kind of through theme that you'll hear as we work through the material today and through the week is this theme of inquiry, the idea that we're grounding a lot of our work in questions, and questions that are interdisciplinary and humanities-based as well as discipline-based. And so one of the ways that we'll talk about this today and going forward through the rest of the week is to think about three areas of change that are really running through scholarship in American literature and American studies today. Time, space, and people. So on the time front, a question that we're asking is how to conceptualize and engage with historical periods and the historicizing of literature. On the space front, we're thinking about how to envision the geography of American literature or the borders around it. So where do we situate it geographically? And then, of course, you won't be surprised, given the way that the identities of the students that we're teaching are expanding, and that our awareness of the need to be inclusive is that we're also addressing that question in terms of who is represented in the curriculum, both in terms of authors and in terms of representation within our texts. For all three of these areas, time, space, and people, there's some recurring questions that occur across all three of those conceptual frameworks. So one is, what are the texts that we teach and how do we teach them? And then secondly is, what learning goals should we set? So why? Why are we studying literature at all, and why are we studying particular texts? So I'm going to take you through each of these three conceptual frameworks. And because I have a long personal history with American literature as a student and as a teacher, one of the things I'm going to do for each of them is to look back a little bit at the way I was taught American literature and the way that I initially was encouraged to teach it when I took American literature and also took pedagogy courses. And then I'll set those memories up in as a kind of contrast with some of the things that I'm trying to do now in my classroom. So starting with time, when I studied American literature in high school and in college, it tended to be organized chronologically, and in terms of literary history, it was often organized around a parade through certain isms, right? So romanticism, realism, naturalism, and each of those tended to be presented to us as students as having a very distinct start date and a very clear end date. So the chronology was presented as if it were relatively fixed, and that you could literally point to a moment when romantic literature arose, and then a moment when it was kind of displaced by realism, and then when realism was displaced by naturalism, and so we would be in periods, and those were constructed periods, but they weren't presented to us as if they were constructed. They were presented to us as a kind of lived reality among the makers of literature. And then the other thing that tended to be used as an organizing principle in our anthologies and in our courses was to link literature to political history. So we might have a unit, say, in an anthology on Civil War literature, or we might have a unit earlier on that might be labeled colonial literature, and some of the texts that we studied and some of the questions that we asked about them were related to patterns in particular events that were going on in political history. And often those, in fact, were male-dominated ones, such as war. Now, some of the challenges to and approaches for complicating those frameworks that I'll be talking about with you today and illustrating with some text, both in the lecture and then later in some of the texts that we work on. One is to think about big, long periods, like say the 19th century or the 18th century or the 20th century, in a more expansive mode. So instead of thinking about 19th century literature as beginning very neatly at, January 1800 and ending in 1899, we're hearing phrases and applying phrases like the long 19th century or the long 18th century. And one of the areas that I work in a lot is, in fact, 19th century. And we tend to start way back in the late 18th century now when we do 19th century literary studies. So we'll start if say the pre-revolutionary era in American literature, or we'll start at the moment of 1776 and talk about why that's a key moment. And then we'll go over into the 20th century and we'll call that 19th century literature. So one of the debates that's going on for right now among 19th century scholars, for instance, is where does the long 19th century stop? And some of us are saying, well, actually it never stops because we're still being shaped by 19th century events and cultural products. But others of us might say, well, okay, let's find some kind of endpoint. So maybe it's World War I, or maybe it's the suffrage moment, which of course we have the anniversary coming up in 2020. And here, really. Another thing on the sort of flip side of expanding chronology is to zero in. And we're seeing that where courses are sometimes being organized around, say, a decade, and we will have a day later this week when we're looking at the 1920s, for instance. Or even I have a few friends who've organized their courses around a particular year. So that digging deep instead of going broad. And while doing that, trying to honor the complexity that's associated with any kind of chronological frame for study. More broadly, we're asking some questions about what does it mean to historicize, and how is that different from doing a kind of decontextualized close reading. When I was first trained as a literature student, there was a big emphasis on close reading, on new criticism, and we were supposed to read the text without thinking so much about the historical context, versus now there's a big commitment to historicizing both the biography of the author, the events going on around the time of production of the text, and also consumption in different time periods. And then in terms of humanities as a real home for literary study, there's more research coming out that literary study in and of itself is one really good way to create a kind of humble cultural empathy without erasing difference, and thinking about what advantages to the society we get when we try very hard to use the capacity of literature to cultivate empathy for people different than us and people living in time periods different than us. So an example of how this works in my teaching that we'll work on in a couple of ways today would be to think about an author like Frances Harper, who had a very, very long career as an author, and to situate different eras in her authorship historically with attention to detail and how those different moments and movements were shaping her work. So here, for instance, you see a picture of her on the left from right around the time period where she gave a very now famous speech in favor of suffrage, but calling out white women suffragettes for their racism and for their failure to think, a term we'd use today, intersectionally. And of course, she didn't have that term available to her then, but we can see and hear in her speech that what she's really doing is saying, I want to affiliate with you and I want to affiliate with this movement, but I also want you to think about my identity as a Black woman and think about the ways in which race needs to be considered as a key issue around the vote as well as gender. And that's a different time in her career than earlier when she was mainly working as an anti-slavery advocate, as you'll hear from Claudia Stokes later in the week. It's also a different time in her career than when her collection in 1890 comes out, Southern Life, Sketches of Southern Life. We're going to look at some poetry from that period. when one of her big concerns was the end of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow and what that was doing to Black people's lives across the US and especially in the South. So a particular text then that would require historicizing would be the speech that I referenced a minute ago, "We're All Bound Up Together," which she gave in 1866, addressing the 11th National Women's Rights Convention in New York, where she joined Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott as featured speakers. But where, as this little excerpt here suggests, she really did try to bring questions about race into the speech and really think about suffrage from a critical perspective. So here's one little snippet from the speech. "We're all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. You tried that in the case of the Negro. You pressed him down for 2 centuries. And in so doing, you crippled the moral strength and paralyzed the spiritual energies of the white men of the country." So she's really anticipating some of the same arguments that come up later from post-colonial scholars like Memy and Aimé Césaire, thinking about the way that oppression of Black people actually hurts white people too. And what it does is it undermines their capacity to see themselves and to act in a kind of, with a kind of moral perspective going on. So you'll see at the bottom of this slide, which you'll be able to get later, there's a link to one of my blog posts about Harper, where I discuss this speech in more detail. Now, later on, we get the Chloe poems. And this is a cycle of poetry that's published in 1890 in Southern Sketches, which is one of her poetry collections. Very different in some ways from the anti-slavery poetry of the early part of her career, from the temperance poetry, because she was also involved in the temperance movement, but also connected to it. And also she's thinking a lot about the history of Black women in the South in this sequence. And later today, we'll look at several individual poems from this cycle, including Aunt Chloe, where she introduces her character, learning to read, and then Aunt Chloe's Politics, which is a poem about voting and the need to, protect the vote and use the vote. So in the initial poem, she introduces us to Chloe as a formerly enslaved person. And it's a narrative lyric that looks back on the experience of Chloe and her family during enslavement. Whereas the Learning to Read poem is set in the then present of Reconstruction and Chloe's access to learning that she gets from going to one of the Reconstruction era schools. And then later poems are set post-Reconstruction, where things are starting to unravel when the Union troops withdraw from the South and many of the advances that had happened during the early stages of Reconstruction start to slide away. Well, in this focus on time that's going on now in a lot of the scholarship in American studies and in teaching, one of the things we're recognizing is that for students to understand a poem like these by Frances Harper in the voice of her character Chloe, we have to do some historical work. We have to make sure that they understand the history, which means we have some questions to ask about when do we bring history into the discussion? Do we start with engagement with the poem itself as poem? Do we give historical information up front? What happens when we take these different approaches? And we'll play around with some of those questions this afternoon when we work on a couple of poems together. The second conceptual framework that's shifting in American literary studies right now is the one of space. So what do we mean when we say American literature or literatures? What do we mean by that term American? And certainly when I was in high school and in my early years studying American literature in college, the space was very much conflated with US. So American literature pretty much meant US literature. And understandably, and I think thankfully, we're kind of moving beyond that right now. And we're also casting a critical eye backward on the way that viewing American literature as US literature really created some problems in the field, and also the way that within that structure of American literature as US literature, there were points of emphasis that we want to be aware were sometimes, problematic or limiting. And one of those was the domination in US literature studies of New England. And the way that New England as a base sort of dominated the way that we thought about American literature. Now, why did that happen? Well, one of the reasons it happened is because the dominant institutions of higher education were located in New England and in the Northeast. So the Ivies like Harvard and Yale and Princeton that started really early, trained people who became the leading scholars. So naturally, that was the region they live in. That's the region they knew. They're going to promote that region. Also, the publication sites for that, where books were published, where newspapers first arose, that had a national reach. There were regional publication houses, say in the South, but they didn't have the same kind of national network of circulation that the big New England and Northeastern ones did. And then the political history of New England dominating the early years of nationhood. Those things together meant that other regions beyond New England were relatively marginalized in the study of American literature, and New England became the kind of dominant one. Now, I grew up in the South. I grew up in North Carolina. So I was one of those students who, started to say, well, wait a minute, what about us? Didn't anybody write anything in the South? Because going through my anthology, studying things that, we were being told were the most important texts to learn about, I didn't see my region reflected. And now there's ongoing efforts to really bring some of those other regional sites into the picture more, and to do so from a critical perspective. And one of the ways that's happening is through the work that academic presses like the University of Georgia are doing with series like the New Southern Studies that's getting new work out. And I thought you might be interested to see their description of that series from their website, and to notice that there's a connection there between region and other important questions about the study of literature coming together. So themes that don't necessarily have to be associated with one particular region being viewed through one regional lens gives us, rich material to look at and to study. So there's a hot trend right now in literary studies called thing theory. And so you can see that reflected here in objecthood, identity, as we said, who's the author, who's being represented in the text, and then space, nation, the body, empire. So post-colonialism, critique of empire. So all the questions that are going on in the big picture being looked at in the particular lens, through the lens and in the location of the South, is one example of how we're seeing, regional literature being studied today. And certainly our region in the country right now, in Texas and throughout the Southwest, is another example of a region that's getting more attention than it did when I was first in school. And you'll hear a bit more about this later in the week, and some of the really influential work by scholars like Gloria Anzaldúa with Borderlands out of Frontera having a huge impact on how we think about literature on the border, in the borderlands, and how we think about particular authors. So Sandra Cisneros, for instance, whose House on Mango Street came out in 1984 before Anzaldúa. That text is set in Chicago, where Cisneros was living then, and it got read a particular way when it first came out that shifted once Anzaldúa's scholarship had come onto the scene, and we started thinking more about how Cisneros actually might be living in Chicago, but also culturally grounded still in Mexico. And we see that happening and being addressed more directly in her later collections, such as Woman Hollering Creek, which we'll hear a bit about later, which was published in 1991, and then Caramello, which came out in 2002. So one of the things that I try to stress with my grad students in particular now is the way that scholarship and creative writing interact, and that the texts that we're getting, the new texts that we're getting, are being shaped by scholarship, and conversely, creative works are shaping the scholarship. So that's another thing that we didn't talk about when I first started studying American Lit. And then another dimension of the shift in the way we think about the space or the shape or the borders of American literature has a parallel to what I said earlier about chronology. Just like the 19th century is getting long, the 18th century is getting long, the starting point and stopping point is expanding, the geographic space of American literature is also expanding. So it's not being equated with US literature anymore. It's really extending its borders to think about Canada, to think about the Caribbean, and even to think in a kind of global context. So how do we globalize American literature? And again, there are key moments in scholarship that tend to have a big impact on the way we think, one being Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic. Gilroy is actually a sociologist, and when The Black Atlantic came out in 1993, it had an immediate impact on the study of American literature, because it helped shift us out of that US framework of land to thinking about the global exchanges that were happening across the Atlantic, including between Africa and the hemisphere that we are situated in. And then Hemispheric American Studies, which came out in 2007, Carolyn Levander being a Texas-based scholar, in fact, has had a really big impact, because it's encouraged us to think more about literature from South America, for instance, to think more about the need to study text and translation from South America, and to think beyond the US as this kind of container, and instead to think about cultural exchange and how it affects the way that literature happens. So regional study in itself then is responding to all of these trends. And what's happening when we do regional studies of literature now is that we're really moving beyond a view of regionalism as focusing on its centrics, as grounded in a kind of provincial brand of rural life, at regional people as as unusual others. So for instance, studies of Southern literature in the past tended to focus on things like the Southern Gothic and the weirdness of the South. And that's really giving way to a much more critical kind of regionalism. We're trying to get away from nostalgia in the study of regional literature, a sort of straightforward celebration, to a more kind of critical stance that recognizes the power of place, but at the same time also makes links between the local and the global. And so what's going on is often referred to as cultivating a critical realism, and alongside that, a transnational, a critical regionalism, and alongside that, a transnational sense of regionalism that digs deep but also situates region in a larger framework, and likewise situates American literature itself in a global network. So let me give an example of how I do that in my own classroom with a particular Texas text that I've been teaching a lot. And I've taught it to freshmen, I've taught it to grad students, I've taught it to English majors. It's one of those things I keep going back to, because whoever the audience is, it does a lot of good cultural work in the classroom. And you may be familiar with this book, News of the World, a novel by Paulette Giles, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. So she's the Texas author. She's also a poet. And the text is really productive as a regional text along the lines I was just talking about, because it presents Texas as a multicultural setting. And it portrays interactions among whites, Mexican Americans, Native Americans going on in the post-Civil War era. So you can see why it would appeal to me, since I do a lot of work with 19th century texts. This is a 21st century text about the 19th century, and specifically about the place where I live now in Texas. It engages many social issues important to the post-Civil War time period in Texas, but also important today. So the premise of the narrative is there's this wonderful central character who's a former Civil War soldier who also has a past living in San Antonio and a mixed race marriage and a history of running a print shop. And now he's lost his print shop. He's traveling around rural Texas, rural at that point, including Dallas. There's a great scene in Dallas as a rural place where he reads News of the World, hence the title of the novel. He gathers newspaper stories from multiple sources all over the world. He performs them for audiences who pay a small fee to come in. And these are a combination of people who don't have access to the kind of print network that he does, who some of them can't read. They love hearing about what's going on in the world. And into that experience that he's having suddenly comes a young white girl who had been captured by Native Americans when her family, all the other members of her family were killed in a raid. And she's been, quote unquote, given back by the tribal community that she's living in exchange for some things. And she's supposed to get home somehow to South Texas. So they go on a journey together. And of course, the cultural exchanges are fascinating. Of course, the way that people react to the two of them end up being really interesting for students to read about. And what we get with this central character is a local Texan with a cosmopolitan viewpoint. So it does, as I say, a lot of great cultural work. I mentioned the book now, even though I know that sometimes you can't get hold of a whole class set of paperbacks, but it's going to be made into a film with Tom Hanks playing the lead. So as a film text, at the least, it should be accessible fairly soon, and I think it would excerpt well too. One other example that I want to give before moving on to people of how those two conceptual frameworks of time and space come together, sort of similarly to in News of the World, is a textbook actually that I'm working on with a colleague from University of Edinburgh and some folks from here in Texas. And it grows out of teaching a course on transatlantic culture for several years. And we first put together a collection of essays on how to teach transatlantic literature. And it ended up getting such a positive reaction from readers and from the press in Edinburgh that we're now working on an anthology of primary texts. And I thought some of the themes that we're using might be interesting to you to hear about. So we have 10 themes, and then within each of those themes, we have a loose chronology, and 3 example themes here: migration and settlement, abolition and aftermath, and nationalism and cosmopolitanism. And what happens when we situate American literature in a transatlantic context is that the texts that we choose to focus on shift, and the familiar texts that we use get read differently. So we'll look at one example in particular this afternoon, a New York Times report on Ida B. Wells's anti-lynching speeches that she gave in the UK in the 1890s. And I'll mention 2 right now. One being, Ben Franklin is the sort of ultimate American. And, we all have taught those texts where, we read Poor Richard's Almanac, and, we read about the kite, and we read about, things that he did as a U.S. figure. Well, the excerpt that we're using in our anthology is actually from when he was living in London, and when for quite a while he thought he was going to stay in London, and he really viewed himself as a British citizen. Because this is before the revolution actually, breaks out. And just hearing his language and hearing his self-construction and seeing what he was doing gives us a different version of Franklin than the one that we're more familiar with. And similarly, Frederick Douglass shows up several times in the anthology. And in the abolition section, we've got speeches and prologues to his speeches, anti-slavery speeches, as given in Dublin and in other places in the UK. So getting away a bit from the familiar narrative of the life to thinking about him as a campaigner, an anti-slavery campaigner in a different setting than the US gives us an enhanced appreciation of Douglass and the kind of work that he was doing as a promoter of the anti-slavery movement. I mentioned Wells earlier. Similar to Harper, you know, when we think about her in relation to time, she's got such a long career, going all the way back to journalism and other writings in relation to her experience getting kicked off of a railroad car where she was trying to ride in first class, winning her lawsuit initially in the 1880s based on this experience of suing the Chesapeake, Ohio and Southwestern Railroad Company, but then losing in the state Supreme Court, and writing about all these things as a journalist, going all the way through into, you know, the 20th century, a whole lifelong career in activism. And often she's thought of in relation to her anti-lynching campaign as a kind of US-based campaign. But like Douglass, she did more than one tour of the UK, and her speeches against lynching there played a big role in gathering support for the movement, not only in the UK, but also in the US. So resituating her geographically as a global citizen changes the way we read her. It also reminds us to read texts that we might not have in the past, such as one that she co-authored with Frederick Douglass that's called Why the Colored American is Not in the World's Columbian Exposition. And it's a pamphlet that came out in 1893 when the World's Fair was happening in Chicago, and when a group of Black activists were really agitating about the failure of the fair to include celebration of Black life and culture as a kind of global you know, phenomenon, and trying to really explain what that absence meant. So it's a text about absence, but it's one that she writes with Douglass out of a global perspective. So again, shifting the boundaries that we work on. And then finally, our third big conceptual framework for really rethinking American literatures is one that you won't be surprised about. I'm sure you're working on a lot in your classrooms, and that's who belongs, right? So how do identities of authors and characters shape the reading and teaching of American literature? And certainly we're all thinking about things like gender. You know, when I first started studying American literature, it was male dominated, as you'll see in a minute. Social class, race and ethnicity, disability, age, and all kinds of cultural community memberships, right? So everything from religious affiliation to what it means, you know, to speak a certain language in your home language, all of those things come into play, both in terms of who the author is and also in terms of who's represented or included in the text. So let me give you an archival artifact to illustrate that we have come fairly far, thank goodness, and that we still have more to do. So my first American Lit course in a college setting was at UNC-Chapel Hill in the 1974-75 school year, and this was my book. It was called 8 American Writers, and these were the writers that were included in the text: Poe, Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, Melville, Whitman, Samuel Clemens / Mark Twain, and Henry James. And my instructor, Richard Fogel, was one of the section editors of this anthology. And I still remember him standing up in front of the class the first day, and he was a wonderful teacher. I mean, he's really shaped my teaching in many ways, but some gaps, right? I still remember him standing up in front of the class and holding up this book that we were going to use and saying, if you learn about these authors, you will know everything you need to know about the most important American literature, which for him was 19th century, and the most important texts, all white male authors. We literally had nobody else in the course than these people. So, you know, all of us know that we want to be more inclusive than that. And one of the strategies that many of us are using in our classrooms to do that is not to get rid of the tradition. The tradition still has value, still important, still great literature, but often to put it in dialogue with other texts. So great example, again, we'll hear some more about this later in the week. What happens when we take Walt Whitman, back from my class with Fogel, I hear Americans singing. And what happens when we put it in dialogue with Langston Hughes? I too sing America, and you're going to hear even a third text in that conversation later in the week. What do we gain, right, without having to give up Whitman, who I still love, just like I still love Melville, and sometimes I even like Henry James. So, one other thing that, of course, is going on is to value, ethnicity and race in our selection of texts, and to recognize that, in particular, different ethnicities have been erased entirely from literature or misrepresented. And one of these, of course, is to think about, what can Native American authors bring to the classroom? And I would just, underscore for you, and again, something that we'll see later in the week in some of our work with some of the later scholars who are going to be here, contemporary Native American literature has so much to offer us. We don't just want to give our sort of nod at the beginning of the year to, some of the folk narratives and oral stuff. We actually want to dip into some of the newer texts. But there we have to educate ourselves. We have to do our homework. We have to learn enough about the authors and about what they're writing about to make smart choices, and to be able to gear our pedagogy around, standards, guidelines, while being, particularly sensitive to issues associated with Native peoples communities right now. So just as a quick example, I will say for many years I was teaching Sherman Alexi's Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian in all kinds of classes. It does lots of good work. I've pulled away from that, partly because of, Me Too related accusations against Alexi, and also just because there's some really good texts that have come out more recently that I want to promote, because I want people to read, contemporary Native authors. One being Tommy Orange's They're There, which, situates Native characters in an urban setting and reminds us that Native people haven't gone anywhere. They haven't disappeared. They're still here. They live among us. They do jobs like we do. They live in locations like we live. And one being Louise Erdrich's The Roundhouse, which, depicts the impact of a rape on a whole family, not just the survivor, and is a great coming of age story too. And then another similar move that I'm making, when I'm making decisions about which text by authors do I want to teach in a particular semester, which texts by Latino authors do I want to take into my curriculum in a particular semester, and how am I going to frame those texts? So as an example, for me, why choose The Nickel Boys over Underground Railroad, both of which great novels by, Whitehead. For me, Nickel Boys is the one I'm using right now, partly because I think it's important, to value recently released texts and to think about entry points that my students can really identify with and where they can build empathy. And one of the ways that I do that is to pair that text with The Circuit, because both of them depict young students in a school setting, a very oppressive one in the case of Nickel Boys. And for The Circuit, we can raise some questions about the bootstraps narrative associated with getting an education from the dominant cultures. There's a lot of possibilities there, that also can pull us to some extent away from stereotyping associated with the racial identities of the protagonists. So in all these cases, I would say, just to wrap up, what I'm trying to do is ask what and how we teach American literature as a kind of moral choice that really reflects the values that we carry and what values we want to think about. So when we consider American literature as a humanities field, we need to ask these big picture questions about building curriculum and the decisions that happen all the way down to a single day and a single, snippet of instructional activity on a particular day, and then big picture, what's in the curriculum, how is it framed, and what is it doing there? And that's one of the benefits of situating American Literary Study as a humanities enterprise in a big way. So I'm going to stop there and